Tonight, you are invited to step away from the noise of the modern world. There is no rush here, no urgency, only a quiet journey into the deep past. In this video, you will hear the true story of Cahokia, a vast ancient city that once stood near the Mississippi River, long before modern America existed. This is not a lecture, and it is not a fast-paced documentary. It is a calm, immersive historical narration designed to help you relax, slow your thoughts, and gently drift towards sleep. You do not need to focus on every detail. Simply listen and let the story unfold at its own pace. Thank you for being here. Welcome History on a Rainy Night. In the central interior of North America, far from oceans and mountain ranges, a city once emerged that challenges many modern assumptions about how complex societies form. It was not built of stone. It left no written records. It was not enclosed by walls, nor ruled by kings whose names survived in texts. And yet, for generations, it functioned as one of the largest and most organized urban centers on the continent. That city was Cahokia. At its height, between the 11th and early 13th centuries, Cahokia stood near what is today the eastern edge of the Mississippi River Valley. Its population likely numbered in the tens of thousands. Even conservative estimates place it among the largest settlements north of Mesoamerica at the time. More important than the precise figure is what such a population required. Sustained food surpluses, coordinated labor, accepted authority, and a shared framework of meaning, capable of binding people together over long periods. Cahokia did not arise suddenly. The Mississippi Valley had been inhabited for centuries by farming communities who cultivated maize, squash, and other crops alongside hunting and fishing. These societies were mobile, adaptive, and deeply connected to the rhythms of their environment. Over time, agricultural productivity increased. Storage techniques improved. Trade networks expanded along river corridors that linked distant regions. By the early 11th century, these gradual developments reached a threshold. Settlement patterns shifted. Smaller communities began to orient themselves toward a central place. Construction intensified. Earthworks on a scale never before seen in the region began to reshape the landscape. Archaeologically, this moment appears abrupt, but it was built on generations of accumulated knowledge and social experience. Cahokia was not an accident of growth. It was organized. At the center of the city lay a vast, open plaza, deliberately cleared and maintained. This was not empty space left over between buildings. It was a focal point, designed to host gatherings, ceremonies, and collective events that reinforced social cohesion. The plaza was surrounded by more than 100 earthen mounds, each serving a specific role within the urban system. Some mounds functioned as platforms for elite residences or ceremonial structures. Others served as burial sites, marking social distinctions and ancestral connections. Their placement followed clear spatial principles. Orientation mattered. Alignment mattered. Movement through the city guided attention and behavior without the need for written instruction. Dominating the entire complex was the largest earthwork, now known as Monk's Mound. Its massive, terraced form rose above the surrounding landscape, visible from great distances. It was not constructed in a single effort, but built and rebuilt over decades. Maintaining such a structure required enormous and sustained labor. Millions of loads of soil were carried by hand, shaped, compacted, and reshaped again and again. people returned year after year to work on a project that offered no immediate personal reward. This alone reveals something essential about Cahokia's social order. Authority was not enforced solely through coercion. It was embedded in shared expectations, ritual obligations, and a collective understanding of place. Participation itself was a form of belonging. Agriculture made this possible. The floodplain soils of the Mississippi Valley were exceptionally fertile. Seasonal flooding deposited nutrients that supported high maize yields. With careful timing and labor coordination, harvests could produce surpluses large enough to support specialists who did not farm full-time. Food security, however, is never simply about production. It is about organization. Evidence suggests that storage and redistribution were managed at a collective or centralized level. Access to surplus passed through social structures rather than individual households alone. In years of abundance, this strengthened loyalty and reinforced the legitimacy of leadership. In years of uncertainty, it increased dependence on the center. Power in Cahokia was visible and spatial. Elite groups occupied elevated platforms. Their physical position above the surrounding population carried symbolic weight. These elevations did not function as fortifications. They were statements of order. Height signified authority. Distance signified distinction. Movement through the city reinforced this hierarchy. Paths converged on the central plaza. Processions followed established routes. Everyday life trained inhabitants to recognize where power resided, without explicit instruction. Ritual provided the unifying framework. Archaeological evidence points to a complex ceremonial calendar tied closely to agricultural cycles. One of the clearest expressions of this relationship is found in the so-called woodhenge structures. Circular arrangements of wooden posts that functioned as solar observatories. From specific positions, observers could mark sunrise points at solstices and equinoxes with remarkable precision. These observations were practical. They guided planting and harvesting schedules, but they were also symbolic. By linking political and ritual authority to celestial cycles, leaders positioned themselves as mediators between cosmic order and human society. Control of time became a form of power. For residents of Cahokia, participation in ritual life defined belonging. The city drew people from across the Mississippi Valley and beyond. What unified them was not shared ancestry, but incorporation into a system that offered meaning, stability, and identity. For nearly 2 centuries, this system worked. Urban space remained coherent. Monumental structures were maintained. Trade networks brought copper, shell, mica, and other materials from distant regions. Craft production flourished. Skeletal evidence from this period suggests that many inhabitants experienced adequate nutrition, at least by pre-modern standards. Equally notable is what is largely absent from the archaeological record during this phase: widespread internal violence. Conflict surely existed, but the system appears to have managed tensions effectively enough to avoid large-scale disruption. Cahokia thus represents a form of urbanism built not on permanent military force, but on integration. Economy, ritual, and spatial design reinforced one another. Authority was maintained because it functioned, and because alternatives were difficult to imagine. Yet, embedded within this apparent stability was an unspoken assumption that the environmental and social conditions supporting the system would remain sufficiently consistent. At this stage, there were no obvious signs of impending failure. Fields produced crops. Ritual calendars aligned with seasons. The city's physical form conveyed permanence. Success itself became a kind of proof. The system felt natural. And when a system feels natural, it rarely prepares for fundamental change. Cahokia entered the 12th century at the height of its confidence. Its order appeared complete. Its structures seemed enduring. Its authority went largely unquestioned. What followed would not be sudden, it would not be dramatic, and it would not begin with collapse. It would begin with pressure, quiet, cumulative, and easy to overlook. The order that defined Cahokia did not survive on belief or ritual alone. It rested on systems that had to work in physical reality, season after season, generation after generation. A settlement of this scale could not depend on improvisation. It required engineering, not expressed through stone architecture or metal tools, but through the organization of land, water, labor, and food across an entire region. Cahokia was built within the American bottom, a vast alluvial plain shaped by the shifting courses of the Mississippi River and its tributaries. For centuries, this environment had supported small farming communities. Its soils were deep and fertile, renewed by periodic flooding. In ecological terms, it was one of the most productive landscapes in North America. For a city, however, productivity came with constraints. Flooding enriched the land, but it also imposed strict limits on timing. Planting seasons were narrow. Harvests had to be completed before excess moisture damaged crops. Storage facilities needed to protect surplus from rot, pests, and unpredictable weather. For small villages, failure could be absorbed through movement or diversification. For Cahokia, concentration removed those options. As population density increased, subsistence became logistics. By the 12th century, Cahokia supported a population numbering in the tens of thousands. Feeding such a population required not only sufficient production, but reliable coordination. Maize became the cornerstone of this system. It produced high caloric yields, could be dried for storage, and fit well within the seasonal rhythms of the region. Over time, agricultural land expanded outward from the urban core in carefully managed zones. Fields had to remain close enough for efficient transport, yet distant enough to avoid repeated flood damage. This balance was fragile. As the city grew, the radius of dependency widened, increasing labor demands and transport costs. Engineering in Cahokia was therefore as much about organization as construction. Fields were not random clearings. They were part of a regional system that required synchronized planting and harvesting. Labor had to be mobilized at specific times across wide areas. Knowledge of soil conditions, flood patterns, and seasonal variation had to be maintained and transmitted accurately. Dependence on maize brought efficiency, but also vulnerability. Archaeological evidence shows that dietary diversity declined as maize consumption increased. Earlier populations relied on a broader range of foods, including wild plants, fish, and game. Later populations depended more heavily on a single staple. This shift did not immediately cause crisis, but it reduced resilience. The city itself was an engineered landscape. Cahokia's central plaza was not a natural feature. It was created through sustained effort, involving the movement and redistribution of enormous volumes of soil. The surface had to remain flat and functional despite heavy use and seasonal rains. Drainage systems were cut to divert water away from ceremonial and administrative areas, preventing flooding from disrupting public life. These systems worked, but only through constant maintenance. Sediment accumulated in channels. Surfaces eroded under foot traffic and rainfall. Earthworks slumped and required rebuilding. Each repair demanded labor, and labor demanded food. The more complex the city became, the more energy was required simply to preserve its existing form. The monumental mounds posed similar challenges. Earth structures settle over time. Rain reshapes slopes. To maintain their symbolic and functional roles, the mounds had to be resurfaced and reinforced repeatedly. These were not one-time achievements, but ongoing commitments. As the urban core expanded, residential areas spread outward in less formal patterns. These neighborhoods were denser and more utilitarian than the monumental center. Houses were rebuilt frequently, often on the same footprints, suggesting limited space and increasing crowding. Refuse accumulated more quickly. Access to clean water became less uniform. One often overlooked pressure was fuel. A city of Cahokia's size required enormous quantities of wood for cooking, heating, construction, and ritual fires. Surrounding forests were steadily exploited. Pollen records indicate a decline in tree species near the site, consistent with long-term deforestation. As nearby sources were depleted, wood had to be gathered from greater distances, increasing labor demands and transport time. Deforestation had cascading effects. Reduced tree cover increased soil erosion. Rainwater flowed more rapidly across the landscape, carrying sediment into fields and drainage systems. Flood events became harder to predict and manage. Fields that had once benefited from controlled flooding became more vulnerable to damage. Cahokia's response to these pressures was not retreat, but intensification. Labor schedules became more structured. Agricultural work, construction, and ritual obligations were increasingly synchronized. Large communal projects served practical purposes while also reinforcing participation in the system. Working together was both necessary and symbolic. From the outside, this appears as resilience. From within, it reduced flexibility. High population density meant that margins for error shrank. Storage facilities could buffer short-term shortages, but they could not absorb repeated disruption indefinitely. Transporting maize from distant fields required precise timing. Spoilage, delay, or loss had immediate consequences. Archaeological layers from this period show frequent rebuilding rather than redesign. Structures were repaired where they stood. Fields were reused despite declining efficiency. Innovation slowed, not because knowledge was lacking, but because deviation carried risk. In tightly coupled systems, experimentation threatens stability. Population pressure also reshaped social relations. As more people depended on centrally managed resources, authority became less negotiable. Access to food, land, and protection flowed through established channels. Compliance was no longer only cultural or ritual, it was practical. For most inhabitants, daily life may still have felt stable. Food arrived, rituals continued, the city functioned. But maintaining that stability required increasing effort. Each year demanded closer coordination, greater labor investment, and stronger trust in leadership. This is how systemic pressure accumulates, not through sudden failure, but through the gradual erosion of slack. The same outcomes require more energy. The system becomes efficient, but brittle. By the late 12th century, Cahokia had engineered itself into a position where success depended on near-perfect alignment between environment, labor, and authority. The city still endured, its systems still functioned, but endurance now came at a cost. Cahokia had become a place where order was maintained through constant work, and where even small disruptions could reverberate through every layer of urban life. The pressure had not yet produced visible crisis, but it had already reshaped the conditions under which the city could survive. For a long time, Cahokia absorbed strain without visible disruption. Engineering compensated for environmental stress. Organization compensated for population density. Ritual compensated for uncertainty. From the perspective of daily life, the city continued to function. Fields were planted, ceremonies were held, authority appeared intact. But systems rarely fail all at once. When the conditions that sustain them begin to shift, the earliest signs are subtle. They do not announce collapse. They appear as irregularities, small deviations that are easy to explain away, especially within societies accustomed to stability. Cahokia entered this phase during the late 12th and early 13th centuries. Modern archaeology allows these changes to be reconstructed with increasing precision. Soil chemistry, pollen records, sediment layers, and regional climate data all point to growing environmental variability during this period. There was no single catastrophic event. Instead, Cahokia encountered a sequence of pressures that challenged assumptions the city had relied on for generations. One of the most significant factors was climatic instability associated with the transition into a cooler and more unpredictable phase, often linked to the Little Ice Age. In the Mississippi Valley, this transition did not mean constant cold or prolonged drought. It meant variability. Growing seasons became less reliable. Temperature fluctuations increased. Rainfall patterns shifted. Extremes occurred more frequently. For an agricultural system dependent on precise timing, this mattered enormously. Maize cultivation requires specific conditions during key growth stages. Even minor deviations in temperature or moisture can reduce yields significantly. Archaeological evidence suggests that harvests during this period became less predictable. One poor year could be absorbed through stored surplus. Repeated fluctuations could not. At the same time, the behavior of the Mississippi River itself began to change. Sediment cores indicate episodes of more intense flooding, alternating with periods of lower water levels. These patterns were harder to anticipate and harder to manage. Fields that had once benefited from seasonal flooding were now at risk of sudden inundation or unexpected dryness. Drainage systems designed for earlier conditions struggled to cope. Floodwater moved faster and carried more sediment, clogging channels and altering soil composition. Human activity amplified these effects. Deforestation around Cahokia had reduced the landscape's ability to absorb rainfall. Soil compaction from intensive agriculture increased runoff. Erosion accelerated. The environment that had once supported the city's growth now responded differently to the same climatic forces. Cahokia's response was not withdrawal. It was intensification. As yields fluctuated, pressure increased to extract more from existing land. Archaeological evidence points to shorter fallow periods and more continuous cultivation. These practices can stabilize production temporarily, but they degrade soil health over time. What appears as resilience in the short term undermines sustainability in the long term. The human body records these changes. Bioarchaeological analysis shows increasing markers of physiological stress in remains from this period. Enamel hyperplasia, interruptions in tooth development associated with childhood stress, becomes more common. Signs of anemia increase. These indicators do not suggest widespread famine. They suggest populations living closer to their biological limits, with less margin for error. At the same time, ritual activity intensified. Excavations reveal renewed investment in ceremonial spaces. Mounds were rebuilt. Plaza surfaces were resurfaced. Astronomical alignments were maintained and adjusted. These projects demanded significant labor at moments when agricultural demands were already rising. From a social perspective, this response is understandable. When uncertainty grows, societies often reinforce familiar frameworks rather than abandon them. Ritual affirms order. It reassures participants that the world remains intelligible. In Cahokia, ritual was not merely symbolic. It was a mechanism of cohesion. But ritual also has limits. Evidence suggests that ceremonial calendars became more rigid rather than more adaptive. Instead of adjusting schedules to changing environmental conditions, established cycles were maintained. This rigidity placed additional strain on labor organization. People were required to meet ritual obligations, even as subsistence demands intensified. Flood events left physical traces within the city itself. Sediment deposits in residential areas indicate repeated episodes of water intrusion. These were not catastrophic floods that destroyed the city, but they disrupted daily life. Stored food was damaged. Houses required repair. Each event eroded confidence in systems that had once felt reliable. Importantly, these stresses were not evenly distributed. Elite areas, elevated on mounds, were better protected from flooding. Access to stored resources was likely prioritized. Peripheral neighborhoods, by contrast, bore the brunt of disruption. This uneven distribution mattered. Shared hardship can strengthen cohesion. Unequal hardship undermines trust. Material culture reflects these tensions. Craft production becomes more standardized. Variation declines. This suggests tighter control over resources and reduced tolerance for experimentation. Long-distance trade appears to contract. Exotic materials arrive less frequently, indicating either reduced exchange capacity or diminishing influence. None of these developments alone indicate collapse. Together, they form a pattern. Cahokia was still functioning. Fields were still cultivated. Ceremonies still took place. The city had not emptied. But the margin that once absorbed disruption was thinning. Systems designed for abundance were now managing instability. For the inhabitants, this would not have been experienced as crisis. It would have been experienced as effort. More labor required to achieve the same results. More ritual required to maintain order. More discipline required to prevent disruption. This is the most dangerous phase in the life of complex societies. Not collapse, but persistence under strain. Because persistence masks vulnerability. Cahokia's leaders likely interpreted these challenges through existing frameworks. Poor harvests could be explained ritually. Floods could be framed cosmologically. Intensified ceremony reinforced the belief that order could be restored through correct observance. But environmental systems do not respond to belief. By the early 13th century, the alignment between climate, agriculture, and infrastructure had shifted enough that recovery required adaptation rather than reinforcement. Such adaptation would have threatened established authority. Changing calendars, redistributing land, or decentralizing control would have undermined the very structure that defined Cahokia's power. So the system held, and in holding, it hardened. The signs of failure were real, measurable, and cumulative. They were written into soils, bones, and sediments. They were not dramatic enough to force immediate change, but persistent enough to shape the future. Cahokia had entered a phase where survival depended not on expansion or confidence, but on endurance under conditions that no longer favored the system it had built. The city did not fall at this moment, but the ground beneath it had already begun to shift. The pressures that accumulated in Cahokia did not immediately produce open rebellion, organized warfare, or dramatic collapse. Archaeology offers no evidence of a city torn apart by a single, violent episode. There are no widespread burn layers, no hastily constructed fortifications, no clear signs of invasion from an external enemy. What emerges instead is something far more difficult to recognize in real time. A slow, internal rupture, unfolding quietly within the social fabric of the city. Cahokia's political order was hierarchical from its foundation. Authority was embedded in space, ritual, and access to resources. During periods of abundance, this hierarchy could operate with limited friction. Surpluses softened inequality. Participation in collective projects reinforced belonging. The system felt stable because it delivered predictability. As environmental and logistical pressures mounted, however, hierarchy became more visible and more consequential. Elite power was expressed physically. Platform mounds elevated residences and ceremonial structures above the surrounding city. This elevation was not defensive, it was symbolic. Height communicated authority. Distance communicated distinction. In times of stability, this separation reinforced order. Under strain, it highlighted inequality. Flooding and subsistence stress did not affect all areas equally. Lower-lying residential zones were more vulnerable to water intrusion and soil degradation. Elevated elite areas were comparatively protected. Access to stored food and labor coordination was likely prioritized through established channels. Over time, hardship became unevenly distributed. Inequalities ceased to be abstract. One of the clearest archaeological indicators of this shift appears in mortuary practices. In earlier phases of Cahokia's history, burials show relatively consistent treatment across social groups. Differences existed, but they were limited. As time progressed, burial patterns changed markedly. Some individuals were interred with extraordinary care. Their graves contained prestige goods, elaborate arrangements, and symbolic materials drawn from distant regions. Others were buried hastily, often in groups, with little evidence of individual distinction. The most striking example comes from Mound 72. Excavations there revealed mass burials that include evidence of large-scale ritual killing. Dozens of young individuals, many of them women, were buried simultaneously in carefully structured patterns. These were not casualties of conflict. There are no signs of combat trauma. Their deaths were deliberate and ceremonial. Such practices are not unique in human history. Ritual sacrifice has occurred in many complex societies, often during periods of stress. What matters is timing and context. In Cahokia, The intensification of ritual killing coincides with environmental instability, subsistence pressure, and growing inequality. Ritual, in this context, shifted in function. What had once reinforced collective identity increasingly served to reaffirm elite authority. Participation became obligation. Belief became enforcement. Ritual did not simply express order, it demanded compliance. For much of the population, this transformation would not have been experienced as overt oppression. It would have been felt as tightening expectations. More labor required, more ceremonies to attend, more rules governing behavior and movement, less room for deviation. There is no evidence of widespread revolt. Instead, the archaeological record suggests disengagement. Peripheral construction slowed. Smaller mounds were no longer maintained. Repairs became less frequent in residential zones. These changes do not indicate rebellion. They indicate exhaustion. When systems demand increasing effort while delivering diminishing returns, participation weakens quietly. Political authority in Cahokia was inseparable from spiritual legitimacy. Leaders did not simply govern resources, they mediated between human society and cosmic order. Their role depended on the perception that rituals worked, that proper observance produced stability. As floods continued despite correct ceremony, as harvests fluctuated despite ritual precision, this perception eroded. Importantly, this did not lead to immediate rejection of the system. Most societies do not abandon foundational beliefs abruptly. Instead, they intensify them. Evidence suggests that Cahokia's leadership doubled down on established practices. Ritual calendars became more rigid. Control over labor tightened. Conformity was emphasized. Material culture reflects this narrowing. Craft production becomes more standardized. Variation declines. Artistic experimentation decreases. These patterns suggest tighter regulation of resources and reduced tolerance for deviation. Long-distance trade networks also appear to contract. Exotic materials arrive less frequently, indicating either declining exchange capacity or weakening influence. Social stress also appears at the individual level. Skeletal remains from this period show a slight increase in trauma markers, consistent with interpersonal violence. These injuries are unevenly distributed and do not match patterns of organized warfare. They suggest localized conflict, disputes within communities rather than between factions. One of the most telling indicators of rupture is demographic. Population decline begins not at the monumental center, but at the margins. Peripheral neighborhoods and satellite settlements thin out first. This pattern suggests that people responded to pressure not by confronting authority, but by withdrawing from it. For a centralized system, this is devastating. Authority based on participation cannot function if people simply leave. Labor becomes harder to mobilize. Ritual loses its audience. The system still exists in form, but not in force. Those who remained in the urban core faced increasing burdens. With fewer participants, infrastructure maintenance fell on a shrinking base. Ritual obligations did not diminish proportionally. If anything, they intensified as leaders attempted to reaffirm coherence. This produced a feedback loop. Greater demands accelerated withdrawal. Withdrawal weakened authority. Weakened authority responded with further intensification. The rupture deepened without ever becoming openly visible. From the perspective of Cahokia's elites, this process may have been incomprehensible. The structures remained, the rituals were correct, the hierarchy endured. And yet, the city was slowly emptying. Cahokia's internal conflict was not a war of factions. It was a fracture between expectation and experience. The system demanded faith at precisely the moment when material conditions undermined confidence. By the early 13th century, Cahokia still stood. Its mounds dominated the landscape. Its plaza remained intact. But the social fabric that animated these spaces was thinning. The rupture had already occurred. It simply had not announced itself. Cahokia was not abandoned in a moment of fear or sudden collapse. There was no final exodus, no singular year that marked the end of the city's life. What occurred instead was a gradual, uneven process, a phased withdrawal that unfolded over decades, shaped by practical decisions, emotional strain, and changing expectations about the future. From an archaeological perspective, this type of ending is unmistakable. The record shows no widespread destruction, no evidence of panic or forced removal. Buildings were not burned. Tools were not left behind in haste. The city did not end in chaos. It thinned. The first signs of abandonment appear not in the monumental core, but beyond it. Satellite settlements surrounding Cahokia began to decline before the city itself showed visible contraction. These communities formed the agricultural and logistical backbone of the urban center. They supplied food, labor, and ritual participants. At the same time, they were more exposed to environmental stress. Flooding, soil exhaustion, and shifting water patterns affected them earlier and more directly. For households in these outlying areas, the decision to leave was not ideological. It was practical. Mobility had always been part of life in the Mississippi Valley. Communities relocated fields, rebuilt villages, and adjusted settlement patterns in response to environmental change long before Cahokia rose to prominence. What made this moment different was that leaving now meant disengaging from a powerful central system that had once offered stability, identity, and meaning. Archaeological surveys show that abandonment was uneven. Some satellite villages emptied relatively quickly. Others declined slowly, shrinking over generations. Houses were rebuilt less frequently. Storage pits went unused. The material footprint grew faint before disappearing entirely. Each departure reduced Cahokia's capacity to sustain itself. With fewer people in the surrounding region, food surpluses declined. Transport distances increased. Labor for construction and maintenance became harder to mobilize. The city responded by drawing more heavily on its immediate hinterland and on the residents who remained within its boundaries. Within Cahokia itself, the pattern repeated. Residential neighborhoods became patchier. Excavated areas reveal increasing gaps between occupied structures. Some compounds were abandoned entirely. Others remained in use but showed signs of neglect. Fewer repairs, simpler construction, less investment in permanence. Urban life depends on density. As density declined, the experience of the city changed. Paths once crowded became quiet. Public gatherings grew smaller. Familiar faces disappeared. These changes altered how residents perceived the future. A city that feels temporary no longer inspires long-term commitment. For those who stayed, daily life grew heavier. Infrastructure still required maintenance. Drainage channels clogged with sediment. Mounds eroded and needed resurfacing. Ritual calendars demanded preparation and participation. With fewer hands, each obligation required more effort per person. The system that once distributed labor across thousands now relied on hundreds. This imbalance created a psychological threshold. Leaving Cahokia was not merely relocation. It meant abandoning a place saturated with meaning. Ancestors were buried in its mounds. Rituals tied the community to cosmic cycles marked by its architecture. To depart was to step away from an entire worldview. Yet increasing numbers of people did exactly that. New settlements emerged along river corridors farther from the old center. These communities retained elements of Mississippian culture, maize agriculture, pottery styles, social customs, but avoided extreme centralization. They were smaller, more flexible, and better adapted to local conditions. This was not cultural collapse. It was reconfiguration. People did not forget what they had learned in Cahokia. They chose not to reproduce its scale. Within the city, inequality sharpened as abandonment progressed. Those with access to elevated land and stored resources remained longer. Peripheral populations left earlier. Bioarchaeological evidence from later phases suggests rising physiological stress among those who stayed behind, a population carrying the weight of a system already losing coherence. Eventually, Cahokia crossed a critical threshold. Not the point of survival, but the point of function. The central plaza could no longer host the gatherings it was designed for. Monumental construction ceased entirely. Rituals continued in diminished form, but without the mass participation that once gave them power. Authority persisted symbolically, but lacked reach. Even then, the city did not vanish overnight. Small groups continued to live among the mounds. Hearths were lit, fields nearby were worked sporadically. Sacred places do not lose significance quickly. But the urban system that once unified thousands no longer existed. What remains archaeologically is a layered record of use and withdrawal. Periods of occupation followed by neglect, brief returns, and final silence. This pattern reflects human decision-making rather than disaster. Cahokia was not destroyed. It was left behind, step by step, by people who weighed the costs of staying against the possibilities of leaving. The human consequences of this process are difficult to quantify. Loss of place, disruption of social ties, and the emotional burden of departure leave few material traces. But they were real. Generations lived through uncertainty, transition, and the gradual dissolution of a world that had once seemed permanent. In this sense, Cahokia's end is not exceptional. It reflects a recurring human response to systems that no longer serve those who sustain them. When participation becomes too costly, people adapt by moving, reshaping, and redefining community. By the middle of the 13th century, Cahokia was no longer a city in any meaningful sense. Its landscape remained, its memory endured, but its role as a central force in the region had passed. The question that remains is not why people left, it is why they stayed for as long as they did. Cahokia is often described as a mystery. The word appears in documentaries, museum exhibits, and popular histories, usually framed as a question. Why did it collapse? Yet, this framing itself is misleading. It suggests that there is a single hidden cause, a dramatic turning point, or a secret yet to be uncovered. Modern research tells a different story. The real mystery of Cahokia is not why it ended, but how it functioned for so long, and how clearly its limits are now visible when examined through the lens of contemporary science. Archaeology does not uncover answers in the form of tidy conclusions. It reconstructs processes. Cahokia's story, as it emerges today, is not one of sudden failure, but of long-term interaction between environment, social organization, belief, and human decision-making. What ended was not a city destroyed by catastrophe, but a system that gradually lost its ability to justify its own costs. Over the last several decades, the study of Cahokia has undergone a transformation. Early excavations focused on monumental structures and artifacts, seeking evidence of greatness or collapse. More recent work integrates multiple scientific disciplines, allowing researchers to understand not just what existed, but how it operated within its environment. Climate science has played a central role in this shift. Through tree ring analysis, sediment cores, and pollen records, researchers have reconstructed patterns of temperature and precipitation across the Mississippi Valley during Cahokia's rise and decline. These data show that the city flourished during a period of relative climatic stability, followed by increasing variability in the 12th and 13th centuries. Importantly, this variability did not manifest as a single prolonged drought or a continuous cold period. Instead, it produced unpredictability. Wet years followed dry ones. Growing seasons shifted. Flooding became less regular and harder to anticipate. For a highly specialized agricultural system, this mattered more than any single extreme event. At the same time, geoarchaeological studies reveal how human modification of the landscape altered local conditions. Extensive deforestation, soil compaction, and intensive cultivation changed how water moved through the environment. Floodplains behaved differently. Erosion increased. Fields became more vulnerable to damage. Cahokia did not simply suffer from environmental change. It participated in reshaping its own constraints. Bioarchaeology adds another layer of understanding. Skeletal remains provide insight into health, nutrition, and stress over time. These data show no evidence of sudden mass starvation or epidemic disease at the moment of abandonment. Instead, they reveal gradual physiological strain, nutritional deficiencies, childhood stress markers, and illnesses associated with dense populations living under sustained pressure. This evidence challenges popular narratives of collapse. There is no sign of a devastating plague. European diseases arrived centuries later. There is no clear indication of large-scale warfare or conquest. No invading force erased Cahokia from the landscape. The city did not fall to violence. Instead, modern science points to a quieter dynamic. Cahokia's complexity was both its strength and its vulnerability. Its systems were efficient, tightly coordinated, and powerful. They produced order, meaning, and identity. But they also required constant participation and precise alignment between social and environmental factors. When those alignments shifted, the system had little flexibility. One of the most important insights of recent research comes from spatial analysis and remote sensing technologies such as LiDAR. These tools allow archaeologists to see subtle landscape features hidden beneath vegetation and modern development. LiDAR surveys have revealed that Cahokia was larger and more intricate than previously believed, with extensive suburbs, modified waterways, and agricultural zones stretching far beyond the monumental core. They also reveal contraction. Later phases show reduced activity, concentrated in smaller areas. Peripheral zones lose definition. Paths fade. Fields fall out of use. The city does not vanish. It retreats. This pattern aligns closely with settlement data from the wider region. As Cahokia declined, new communities appeared elsewhere. These settlements carried forward Mississippian cultural traditions, but avoided the extreme centralization that had defined Cahokia. Authority was more local. Scale was reduced. Flexibility returned. From a modern perspective, this looks less like failure and more like adaptation. The people of Cahokia did not lose their knowledge. They did not abandon agriculture, ritual, or social organization. They abandoned a particular configuration of those elements, one that no longer balanced cost and benefit under changing conditions. What modern science cannot fully reconstruct are the internal conversations that guided these decisions. Archaeology leaves us with patterns, not voices. We do not know how leaders interpreted environmental change, how households debated staying or leaving, or how belief systems evolved in response to persistent stress. These silences are part of the story. They remind us that past societies were not abstract systems, but collections of individuals navigating uncertainty with incomplete information, much like societies today. The real mystery of Cahokia, then, is not an unanswered question waiting for a dramatic solution. It is a lesson in limits. It shows how even highly successful systems can become fragile when they grow too rigid. It demonstrates that order, once established, can resist adaptation, even when adaptation is necessary. Cahokia also challenges modern assumptions about progress. For centuries, it was overlooked or dismissed because it did not fit familiar models of civilization. It left no writing, no stone cities, no dynastic histories. And yet, it organized tens of thousands of people, coordinated massive labor projects, and sustained urban life for generations. Its achievements were real. So was its ending. What remains today are the earthworks, shaped soil rising quietly from the landscape. They are not ruins in the traditional sense. They are traces of intention, effort, and belief. They endure not because they were indestructible, but because they were woven into the land itself. Modern science allows us to see Cahokia with clarity rather than myth. It replaces mystery with understanding, without stripping the story of meaning. The city does not need a dramatic explanation to matter. Cahokia matters because it reveals something enduring about human societies. Not all endings are catastrophes. Not all departures are failures. And not all silence marks forgetting. Sometimes, silence is what remains when a system has completed its role, and people, quietly and rationally, choose another way forward. You have now reached the end of this journey into the ancient world of Cahokia. Whether you are still awake or already drifting into sleep, thank you for spending this time here. If you found this story calming, meaningful, or helpful, you are welcome to subscribe to the channel. New immersive history videos are released regularly, each one designed to be listened to slowly and peacefully. You may also leave a comment sharing where you are listening from or which ancient civilization you would like to hear about next. And if this video helped you relax, a simple like quietly supports the channel. and allows these stories to continue. Wherever you are in the world, may your night be calm and your sleep undisturbed.